Well, I'm really looking forward to this one here. Always good to get some new voices on Bang the Book Radio. We're joined now by @Whale_Capper on Twitter, who goes by White Whale. So what the hell? That's what I'm going to call him. Mr. Whale, how's it going today, man?
It's going fantastic. How are you doing this morning, Adam?
I'm doing very well. Appreciate your time. Good to get you on the show here. I know that you've got a very strong Twitter following. You've had a lot of success in both the NFL and the NBA, so that's what we're going to chat about here on today's show. And obviously, with this being Week 17 of the NFL, it's maybe not the most ideal time to get you on the show here, and we'll see what we can do in future seasons. But this is a very difficult week to handicap.
It's the toughest. I think you pretty much have to throw totals out the window this week because God knows what you're going to get in terms of coaches' approach to resting their players and how many teams are just trying to run out the clock on the season. So I'm probably going to stay off of all of the totals this week. I usually try to have a pretty balanced card between sides and totals, but I'm probably going to have a late card anyway, and I'm definitely not looking for many overs or unders. When it comes to sides, the difference is usually made by, who's going after bonuses, who's trying to make milestones, who's trying to finish at the top of the statistical categories and, receiving yards, rushing yards, passing yards, things like that. And so, in terms of evaluating value on sides, you kind of have to really, really, really do your homework, figure out who's going to get the most playing time, who's going after big bonuses, and I wish I could tell you I had a whole lot of angles on that right now, but there's still very little information out there as far as who we're going to see get significant playing time this week. So Week 17 is by far the toughest week of handicapping the NFL, in my opinion.
Well, and for those that play daily fantasy, try to find some information there on who's up for bonuses and who can, reach some of those milestones. I know that's something I talked about in my MLB daily fantasy article late in the year. Those guys looking for nice round numbers, 30 home runs, 100 RBI, 300 average, all that. Guys that are highly motivated late in the year, no matter what situations their respective teams are in. Obviously, you get that in the NFL here as well with guys looking for contracts the next season. But I think one of the biggest angles you can look at here in Week 17, and I kind of mentioned this earlier on in the week on one of the shows, is that it's almost like the preseason. You have the coaches being
yes.
very open about what their plans are, about who's going to play, how long they're going to play. Obviously, we've seen some adjustments out there in the marketplace. Kansas City saying that they're not playing anybody. The Rams saying that they're not playing anybody. We've seen over a touchdown line move from the open in that game. So you do have that element in play a little bit in that the coaches are telling you what's going on. So is this maybe a better week to look at some derivative options or live betting?
Oh, yes. Live betting especially. You're going to see some second half lines that are kind of based on sort of the traditional season-long models that don't factor that stuff in for sure. You're going to see live options where, a great example may be like Carolina Panthers, right? Like that line suggests that you're going to have a pretty competitive game. Carolina maybe has less to play for than Atlanta because they can't do much about their seeding unless like a million awesome things work to their advantage. But if Minnesota handles their business in the morning, and and if the Saints are taking care of the business versus the Bucks, there's really no reason for Ron Rivera to keep his guys, going full throttle in the second half of that game. And you might see, some line value. You may see some live value open up on the Falcons. You might see something open up on an under or an interesting total somewhere in game. So those angles are going to be wide open. And actually, thinking back into years past, the most success I've had in Week 17 has absolutely been finding second half unders for games where you knew that the coaches were both just going to run out the clock on the season. So that's a great angle.
Yeah, and it certainly does make a lot of sense too, especially when you talk about a Carolina-Atlanta situation. Whether they see it during halftime or whether the score is up somewhere, at Mercedes-Benz Stadium, they're going to know what's going on with New Orleans. If they want to find out, they're going to find out, even if Ron Rivera tries to keep it from them or whatever else. It's also in Ron Rivera's best interest to know what's going on, because if New Orleans goes out 17-0 or something like that, I don't know what his plan is with Cam Newton. I haven't read anything about it yet, but if New Orleans is up 17-0, Cam Newton shouldn't play at all in the second half and probably shouldn't play from that point on. Christian McCaffrey, put him in bubble wrap, protect him. Greg Olsen, same thing. Luke Kuechly, Thomas Davis, no reason those guys should play the second half. And I like what you said there that, a lot of times these live betting or the second half things, it's just a chart or a formula or an algorithm, something like that. You don't actually have, in most cases, people putting these lines up live, people sitting there watching all these games, making adjustments. It's going to be based on the pregame line, the handle, and then, of course, whatever the formula says for them to put up. So, Carolina's second half line with Derek Anderson at quarterback and none of the skill position players playing may be the same as the number would be with Cam Newton playing because they're not capable of making that adjustment at the halftime. So, again, you want to be making sure that you're watching very, very closely for those things.
Absolutely agreed. And I think there's probably line value in Atlanta -4. I could completely see a scenario where by the time that game kicks off, if Minnesota takes care of business in the morning and it's pretty clear that Carolina can't even really play for a bye and they're going to need 18 things to go in their favor to get a home game, I could see Carolina, I could see the market kind of respond to that and this -4 drift out to, like, say, -6 or -7 even by the time this kicks off.
That's an interesting point, and I want to elaborate on that a little bit because with the previous guest, Brad Powers, we talked on last week's show about getting Kansas State -2.5 for the Cactus Bowl as a speculatory grab just in case Josh Rosen came out and said, yeah, I'm not playing. Well, of course, that's exactly what happened. Kansas State wound up being a 6.5-point favorite, so if you grabbed the 2.5, you had 4 points of line value right away. So that's something in Week 17 that I guess you can afford to do, and in-game running allows you to, buy off or limit your exposure if you want to. But I think you're right in that, grabbing Atlanta at there's a rogue 3.5 at the Greek, for example. Maybe you can find one out there at a brick and mortar in Las Vegas. But even taking a 4, what does this number become live if Carolina has nothing to play for in the second half? This number may be 14 or something like that in the second half if they pack things away, and you're sitting there with a full game -4. There's a lot of value in that.
I 100% agree. Carolina, to take this one step further, Carolina needs a blow, man. They've been playing really hard games. They've been playing tough competition. You could see they were getting a little tired in that game last week against Tampa Bay. They should have beaten Tampa Bay handily, but they needed some late magic to secure that win. These guys could use a little bit of a blow. I think Ron Rivera knows that. I think he knows he's got his work cut out for him going on the road in the playoffs here, but he knows that he's got one of the more experienced teams in the playoffs and probably thinks that people are sleeping on them and he can get his team up and motivated to do something good. So I think keeping his team healthy and rested is going to be his primary goal coming into and out of this week. So that's a great look. And my good buddy Andy, who I do the podcast with, the deep dive, he was, we were chatting as they were opening up lines for this weekend, and he did some of the speculative play on San Francisco. We were looking at the motivations and the angles here, and we thought, hey, for what purpose would McVay force this and try to win this game to get the 3 seed so he could go to Minnesota in the 2 seed? He probably feels like he has a better matchup against Philadelphia anyway, and obviously you can't expect that, you're going to be able to control your destiny if you're the 4 seed. You're going to end up wherever you end up, depending on the other wild card outcome. But it would make more sense if I was McVay and if I was the Rams, I would be more interested in playing Philly than I would be playing Minnesota. So in the second round of the playoffs, that is. So it kind of was an obvious, and you could see it coming, that they were going to, pull some of their starters and probably not give us an honest effort in this game. On top of the fact that here you're playing San Francisco, a team that, as you look into the future, you're going to have some very tough competition between LA and San Francisco for the NFC West for years to come. So it didn't make sense that you would necessarily put your best game plan out there, expose all of your new and innovative offensive tactics to your future toughest competition. So this was an easy one to see coming a mile away, and my buddy Andy definitely was like, why is San Francisco plus plus anything here in this money line on the open, and grab that, and now has a chance to come back on plus money for the Rams. So remember this, file this away for next year. Stay close when they open these lines for Week 17, and try to do what you can to speculate just like you would for the bowls, depending on who's going to play.
One of the things we talked about in yesterday's show is the game between the Texans and the Colts, and how you have two questionable coaching situations. Chuck Pagano probably gone. Bill O'Brien probably not gone. I know I didn't list this game in the outline that I sent you this morning here, so I apologize for that. But
no,
it is something I was looking at a little bit here this morning. The NFC North matchup, 303-304 between Green Bay and Detroit. We know Green Bay is going to make some coaching changes. They'll probably fire Dom Capers. Mike McCarthy's probably safe. I don't know if he should be, but he probably is. Detroit, on the other hand, there's a lot of question marks regarding the future job security for Jim Caldwell. And this is a situation that you have to try to read, not just in Week 16 or Week 17, but in Week 16 and 15 probably as well, is that, what do you look for in terms of trying to gauge whether or not a team is going to come out and fight for a coach, or if they're just going to play out the string?
Man, looking for signals to help understand that is extremely tough. You pretty much have to just take a leap of faith if you're going to try to bet on that angle. But you're absolutely right. I mean, we saw it with the Giants and Ben McAdoo, like 5 times this season. The defense sent a very clear message to management: we do not want to play for this guy. And so you kind of have to read. I like to look at what the beat writers are quoting players in the locker room, especially on the defense, with the defense, because the defense always kind of it's a tighter group, right? Like they're a unit as opposed to the offense, which really revolves around the quarterback. And so you want to hear what, obviously if there's a quarterback who has a lot of sway, you want to know what they have to say about the situation. And if there's a defense that has kind of a prevailing opinion, you want to know what they have to say about it. And you're going to get that from the beat writers. And if you have any sense of, we're done fighting for this guy and we're going to send a message to the coaching staff and management that we want a new coach, then they're going to do it Week 17. And it doesn't always work out. And these two games you brought up, I could see both teams trying to send a message to their management. I agree with you. Pagano this is probably his last game as a head coach in the NFL. I think actually I disagree with you on Bill O'Brien. I don't think they're going to bring him back in 2018. I think the writing was on the wall last year that the ongnership and management doesn't really have the same vision for the future of the franchise that Bill O'Brien does. And now they have Deshaun Watson, who you're going to be able to get a really good coaching prospect that wants to come and coach Deshaun Watson and wants to, have this defense with all these blue chip players. This is probably one of the easier jobs to fill if you're out there trying to recruit innovative mind in the NFL, which a lot of teams are going to be doing. There's going to be like 7 or 8 coaching vacancies this year, and I do think Houston's going to move on from Bill O'Brien. And what's funny is you look at the quotes from Bill O'Brien this week. I feels like he is sucking up to Jim Irsay. Like he wants this Indy job, maybe. So I'm interested to see how that plays out and what kind of chumminess we see between the Bill O'Brien and the Colts this week. Because if I didn't know any better, just reading the quotes, I would think Bill O'Brien knows he's on his way out, and he's trying to pave the way for another head coaching spot in Indianapolis with Andrew Luck as his quarterback next year.
Well, and 2 of the other games that we're going to talk about here a little bit more in depth have different coaching situations, beginning with game 301-302. Cincinnati takes on Baltimore. Baltimore, they're 31st in the league in yards per play, and they're out here laying yet another big number this week. But Marvin Lewis is done in Cincinnati, and we know that. We've known that now for a few weeks' time. The Bengals did step up last week at home and beat the Lions and officially remove them from playoff contention. But now this is Marvin Lewis's swan song. This one's not at home. It's on the road against a division opponent in Baltimore. But this is it. This is the last game for this guy, and who knows, where he'll wind up going next year. was last week the last stand for the Bengals in terms of stepping up for this guy, or do you think that they do it again here this week and cover a number against a team that, much like last week, probably shouldn't be favored by this much?
Yeah, I'm not expecting Cincinnati to show up in a way that they in any way threaten to win this game. I think last week was their finale for Lewis, and it was at home, so it made more sense, and it was against a team that had vulnerabilities, and I don't think we've seen the best that Baltimore has yet. I think we know that their defense is legitimate, and they have some pieces on offense that are starting to click. And while I would never advocate laying 10 points in a divisional matchup because it just feels, these teams know each other well enough that you could just see a close, grinded out kind of game. This is probably it for Marvin Lewis in Cincinnati, and I don't know that there's much that they can do to get him a win on his way out the door, which means you're literally saying, okay, well, they're going to keep it within a touchdown or they're going to get a backdoor cover, and I don't know, too sketchy to get involved with from my standpoint.
Now, the other game I want to focus on here, again, 327, 328, Arizona and Seattle. Here you have a case where it's largely up to the head coach. If Bruce Arians wants to come back, the Cardinals will probably welcome him back, even though there was a report last week that the two sides agreed to part ways. He said that's not the case. He just wants to decide if he wants to coach next year or not. Seattle obviously has some incentive here. They need to win this game and get an Atlanta loss to get into the playoffs. They're a 9.5-point favorite. But for Arizona, you sort of wonder what the mindset is of the players. I mean, this is a team that, does have a lot of veteran leadership on both sides of the ball. But, does what they do in this game have any tangible impact on what Bruce Arians decides to do? I don't really know. So that kind of puts them almost in limbo this week.
Yeah, it certainly does. If I'm the Cardinals, I'm probably afraid to lose Arians, to be honest. I look across the league at some of the next tier of up-and-coming talent in the head coaching ranks, and it does not look promising. I mean, you're almost certainly going to be either taking a huge risk with a young coach who's unproven, or you're going to try to, recycle one of the retreads who are, uninspiring. I like Bruce Arians. I think he's is a great motivator and a pretty impressive offensive mind. I didn't love the roster construction this year for the Cardinals, and I think that with a few tweaks they can do a little bit better next year. But I don't know. The future in Arizona looks really rocky because of how the Rams have emerged and late in the season the Niners have emerged. And so it's a real tough thing to speculate on what the Cardinals are going to do in terms of their motivational angles coming into this game and trying to, show Bruce that they want him to come back next year, the players at least. Can almost say that this is a tight rivalry. I mean, these teams, there's no love lost here, believe it or not. And the Cardinals play the Seahawks extremely tough, regardless of whether or not there were playoff implications. And I almost feel like that the player-to-player or the player versus team kind of motivational aspects may trump anything that would come up in terms of like the future of the franchise and the future of the coach. And I'm expecting the Cardinals to come up and play a pretty motivated effort out of this squad. I'm a little nervous because it's not clear who the quarterback's going to be for the Cardinals, and it's tough. I think the line drifting from 7 out to 10 is obviously a little disconcerting, but at the same time, 10 points in a divisional matchup where you have a Cardinals team that has they have nothing to lose, going out there and trying to spoil Seahawks who they don't like. It's a good angle. I like the Cardinals to keep this thing close. And Seattle, we saw the effort that they gave against Dallas last week was impressive, but the idea that they're going to be able to duplicate that in back-to-back weeks, it's It's not obvious to me, so I'll probably be getting involved back in the Cardinals in some way, shape, or form this week. It's maybe another one to look live. I mean, if Seattle scores early, you could see the market really flip in their favor even more so, and think, okay, well, the Cardinals are going to quit here. But I wouldn't expect them to quit even down early. I would expect the Cardinals to fight and try to score and try to claw their way back into this. So you may be able to get an even larger line live if Seattle looks good early, which they rarely do, but you never know.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly expect the Cardinals not to quit, because if you go 7-9 by NFL rule, you're forced to hire Jeff Fisher. So they certainly don't want that to happen by falling off here in the second half. Now,
right.
Here's a really interesting game for a lot of different reasons. Jacksonville and Tennessee. This is probably my favorite game of the weekend from a handicapping standpoint. I almost like, having to dig through and figure out all these angles and all this stuff more so than seeing the money head into my bankroll, just because I that's what I love about this industry. I love being able to study these matchups and try to put the pieces of the puzzle together. This game is fascinating. Obviously for Tennessee, a lot on the line. If they win, they're in. They're a field goal favorite against Jacksonville. Jacksonville, on the other hand, going to the playoffs, hosting a playoff game for the first time since 2000, and they have not played well down the stretch. So Doug Marrone can't afford to rest his starters here, and that's why we've seen this number adjust from 6 down to 3. He needs to get some kind of chemistry going, get something going in the right direction for this team as they head into the playoffs. So they have a lot of incentive here. It doesn't look like they do because they're already in and they've already won the division, but there's a lot on the line for them in terms of smoothing out the rough edges for their playoff game next week. And Tennessee, like I said, win and you're in. So this is probably the purest handicap of the weekend, I would think.
100% agree with you. I love the way you set that up. The last year, there's almost a perfect analog to what happened last season as well. And it was the only kind of full unit pregame play I made week 17 last season, and it was the Giants at the Redskins. The narrative all week was the Giants have nothing to play for. The Redskins win and they're in. This game, this is the Giants are going to rest all their players if they go down early, like they had, But lo and behold, we knew that the Giants had they had made their quotes. Their quotes throughout the week were pretty clear. They weren't considering this a throw-in game. They had lost week 16. They felt like they needed to get a little momentum going into the playoffs. And whenever the New York Giants have had success in the playoffs, it's been because they've had some late season wins and they carried that momentum in and won on the road. And so they were trying to replicate that feeling and that energy. And so you knew it was coming, that they weren't going to lay it down against the Redskins. And here they were like, I don't know, maybe they opened as 3-point dogs and it drifted all the way out to 10. And I was like, this is ludicrous, man. These guys aren't going to quit. They think they need to win this game to have the momentum to be anything in the playoffs. They're going to try hard. And sure enough, they outright won. And now you can see it coming a mile away. And I think that we're looking at a similar situation here. The fact that Coughlin is in the front office and has this kind of mindset notwithstanding, I do think that the Jaguars feel like they need a win. They need to get their momentum going in the right direction before they go into this playoffs. I don't think you want to have back-to-back losses and then, face a team that's played their way in, especially if that team is the team that just beat you week 17. The scenario that scares me if I'm the Jaguars is we lost to Tennessee week 2. This team knows us well. We've had a tough time beating this team historically in the tenure of most of the players that are here, and we couldn't beat them twice this year. And here they go. They are now the 6th seed coming into our house for wild card weekend. Can we beat them this time? And I don't think you want to have to face those questions for the media. I don't think you want your players thinking about that stuff. I think you want to put Tennessee out of their misery this week. If you're Jacksonville, I think you want to get a win, get some momentum going into the playoffs, and then, you can talk yourself up to whoever your wild card opponent is, presumably the LA Chargers. I got my fingers crossed, at least, that it's the Chargers, so we'll see.
Well, and that's interesting, too, because then you'd have a Chargers team coming cross-country after having to win in Week 17 and get some help to get in. That creates a pretty bad situational spot for Los Angeles coming all the way out to Florida. So in that respect too. I mean, there's a little bit more value. Of course, you have the Gus Bradley angle and all that, but that's a matchup that's probably better for Jacksonville, even though I think the Chargers are a better team than the Titans because they're a little bit more versatile and they have a much, much, much better defense than Tennessee does. But still, yeah, I mean, if you're talking about a team that you've not had much success against, a team you've lost to twice this season, you got to play them again. And you're a team that's not accustomed to going to the playoffs. And something I talk about a lot here on this show is that it's great to have that one-off year or 2 straight years where you make the playoffs and you get expectations and this and that. It's another thing to live up to those and actually make that the culture that you have. And for Jacksonville here late in the year, it just sort of feels like they're not embracing success all that well. And like you said, this is a week for them to actually show that they can do that and give themselves a little bit of positive momentum going into next weekend.
100, yeah, I agree 100%. You saw after they clinched, they kind of fell apart mentally in that game against San Francisco. Guys fighting each other on the sidelines, making the same old dumb mistakes that we saw them make before they kind of had their, everything came together for them this season. Yeah, if you're Doug Marrone, if you're Tom Coughlin in the front office, I think you're like, we are going to use this as an opportunity to get everybody rowing the boat in the same direction. We're going to put Tennessee out of their misery so we don't have to face them a third time this season. And then, hey, you never know. I mean, Oakland could surprise and the mini black hole in L.A. the Chargers could do something Chargery, and you could get to face the Bills. So there's more at stake here than I think people are realizing. And I'm not, and this all goes into a whole different point. I really do not like Mike Mularkey, and I think his game planning and his in-game decision-making is among the worst of the head coaches in the league. And so even beyond just if Jags are particularly motivated and have it come out with a real game plan and play their starters all 4 quarters, even if they don't, I'm not feeling too bad fading a Mike Mularkey team, even when they absolutely need a win to keep their playoff hopes alive.
All right, let's transition over to the hardwood here for a few minutes and talk a little bit of NBA. And for those that don't know, @Whale_Capper posts his NBA projections out there with the final scores that you have in mind for the games coming up that evening. So I don't want you to pull the curtain too far back. We don't need to see everything, but what sorts of statistics or other types of things do you have there, in whatever model spits out the projections for you?
So I handicap tennis, NFL, and NBA, and I use numerical models in all 3, but in very different ways. And NBA is probably the one where I lean the most on the numbers, because it's I guess it lends itself to that the most easily. There are so many games, there's so much data, and you can really do some pretty innovative statistical analyses, back calculate how to appropriately capture team level performance once you have a pretty solid statistical database to work with. And here we are now in December. We've had, most teams have played 30, 35 games, or actually, I guess we're up to like about 35, 38 games. And so you have a pretty good idea of who these teams are statistically. And I try to keep it pretty simple. I like to look at efficiency statistics, and I like to look at effectively average offensive and defensive efficiency and pace adjusted for opponent. So we're trying to come up with basically a solid baseline projection of how a team would perform on a given night in terms of they're expected to have this offensive efficiency, this defensive efficiency, and they'll probably be this many possessions. And you can combine all these in a really simple way to get it. And then that's a reasonable baseline. So in a neutral situation on a neutral court, we'll say the Rockets and the Celtics might be expected to score something like Rockets, 110, Celtics 108 or something like that. And that's just combining offensive, defensive efficiency and pace. Now, having a good baseline is really just step one. Because in the NBA, what tends to matter, especially once we get into this part of the season, I'll say this: numerical modeling and all this stuff, it works well in certain portions of the season, and it works really poorly in other portions of the season. I've found over the last several years. I'm kind of mired in the part of the season where it's not working very well. It was electric in November when you had relatively healthy squads. Teams had kind of established their identity, and you knew what their approaches were more or less. In December, things get real dicey because you have lots of different rest patterns because coaches are dealing with players who are starting to get beat up, and you have surprise injuries and surprise rest, and teams are experimenting with new ideas about how they want to run their offense and defenses. They're starting to practice certain adjustments in game, and that stuff doesn't necessarily come through when all you're doing is looking at team level statistics. And so it's really tough this time of year to kind of use this model-based approach to find value in sides and totals. But again, once you have a baseline, then you can kind of go after, how do I make appropriate adjustments to this? This key player is out. I'm gonna turn the offensive and defensive knobs up and down one standard deviation. This team is on back-to-back nights, so I'm gonna turn the pace knob up or down, or turn the defensive. So basically, you can kind of turn the knobs to count for the situations, the injuries, and whatever else you feel like is an important situational factor to account for. And then when it's all said and done, I look at what the sides and where I have more than a 3-pointer edge on sides and totals, and try to winnow it down to say 5 plays a night. And it's a grind, but I'm looking for 3 and 2 every night for the whole season, and then we'll make money in the long term.
Yeah, I like that that's the approach that you take, and I like that I can sort of expand a little bit on that with you, because when it comes to baseball, I'm very analytics-based. I love looking at sabermetrics. I'm huge into those numbers. When it comes to the other sports, not so much, in part because I just don't have as much interest in them as I do in baseball, but also because I apply different handicapping techniques, specifically in the NBA, a lot of situational stuff, looking at back-to-backs, 3s and 4s, 4 and 6s, all that type of thing. So
nice.
One of the things that's challenging about that is that it's hard to quantify those things. How much does a back-to-back actually mean? Is a back-to-back worse when you're leaving Toronto and you have to go through customs when you leave town, or customs when you get to the next city? Is that worse than going from New York to Indiana, or Indiana to Dallas, something where you've got longer travel? All of that stuff is kind of subjective in nature. So, it's hard for me sometimes to go about it that way, because I'm so analytics-based in some sports and less so in others. But what you do to counteract that is, you'll adjust your pace expectations a little bit, and that's going to change pretty much the whole formula, right?
Absolutely, yeah. No, and I agree. It's subjective. I like to have what I think of as a good baseline, because let's say I projected 8 scores for a regular night of basketball. Let's say I got all 8 of them exactly right. It's not because I figured out the magic formula whatsoever. It's that I had a good baseline, and I made I guessed at the correct adjustments to make for each team, right? There's a lot of subjectivity into, okay, well, Chris Paul's out for the Rockets tonight. How much does that affect their offensive and their defensive efficiency? You don't know that, a priori, so you're going to have to make some guess at the adjustment, and you could guess exactly right, or you could be way off. But as long as you're doing it in sort of a system-oriented process, and you can, back calculate certain things and see where you were right or wrong in your subjective assessment of this stuff, then you can kind of build a mental model as the season goes along and get better and better at doing this. And presumably over the long run, you're going to get you're going to get more right than you get wrong.
All right, so let me ask you how you account for this then. You mentioned the Houston-Boston game, and again, I encourage our listeners to go and check out @Whale_Capper and see his projections for tonight's games when he puts them up. But I like to do more of the technical aspects on this show and give our listeners the tools to do a lot of these things for themselves and have a good understanding of how the markets work. So Houston plays a very big game tonight against Boston, and it's a big game because it's on TNT. You've got the top two teams in each conference, all that type of thing. It's a game that both teams should be invested in. Tomorrow night, Houston plays in Washington. Now, Washington's a team that's been up and down with John Wall being out, and they've played some big games here of late as well against some really good teams. Then they played some games against some not-so-good teams. So what would your approach be in a situation like that, with Houston going from playing in Boston on TNT to playing, in Washington tomorrow night on NBA TV? How do you account for that when you've got a model that's largely, based in quantifiable metrics?
Okay, so it's interesting because it's definitely, for me at least, it's definitely team specific, right? It's like you have to kind of think of, well, what is this, a veteran team? Is it a young team? Is this a team that is struggling right now in the season, or they're like coming on strong? Is this a team that has a lot to play for in these couple games, or are they like coasting right now and just trying to stay at around 500 because they've gotten enough wins early in the season that they know that they're going to the playoffs and they're not really worried about all of this stuff? I think, if you can kind of evaluate those X factors, I guess, then you know where to start on this sort of stuff. And when it comes to, like, I guess, a veteran team, and I guess I'll qualify Houston as a veteran team. At least their leaders have been around long enough that you would expect these guys are KG vets. I actually don't mind backing veteran teams on backs-to-backs. I worry more about young teams because a lot of times they're not as experienced in how to deal with the fatigue of playing on back-to-backs, whereas the veteran teams, even though, and this is kind of counterintuitive because you'd think, well, the veteran teams are older, they're going to have a tougher time coming out 2 games in a row and playing hard. But they've been doing it their whole careers. They've figured out what they need to do to get their bodies right to be ready for this sort of stuff. Whereas the younger teams are a little bit more, a little less prepared for this. And so, like, Boston's on a back-to-back tonight. They played in Charlotte last night. Now they're home playing the Rockets. It's a relatively young team. I mean, granted, the leaders are Kyrie Irving and Horford have been around a long time, but they're leaning a lot on Jason Tatum. They're leaning a lot on the young crew, and on top of that, they're really struggling in the second unit right now for the Celtics. So all of those are factors why I would not be interested in backing the Celtics on a night like tonight. Whereas with Houston on a back-to-back tomorrow in Washington, I'm going to be looking for line value because it's possible that the market can over-adjust for this sort of thing. And all you're really trying to do is figure out, because everybody knows that it's a back-to-back, right? Presumably that's built into the price a bit. It's built into the line movement once the price is opened. And so you kind of have to figure out, has value opened up here in this spot on the back-to-back because people have have assumed too much or read too much into the angle itself. And ironically, with a veteran team like Houston or OKC or something like that, I am more concerned about them when they have a day off on a long road trip, right? Like when you have these guys on a long road trip and they have a day off in a city and they're veterans, like they're going to go out, they're going to blow off a little steam, they're going to go to their favorite, watering holes in a given city, and then maybe they're less ready to play the next day. Right, where it's a back-to-back, maybe they're just like, okay, this is, they're a little more focused on what's going on and present and in the moment on the second night. So those are just kind of some of the X factors that you try to incorporate to gain an edge in the NBA. And there's so many games and such a long season that you just have to kind of keep your head down and keep looking for it and not get discouraged when things get tough.
One last thing I want to ask you about here, and then I'll let you go, is the dichotomy between a situation like that with a team like Houston playing, Boston. I mean, that's like I said, it's a big game for them. It's a game that's got a lot of fanfare. then going and playing Washington. A veteran team is probably going to treat a lot of games similarly, whereas young teams are going to step up for some big opponents and then maybe not step up the next night. Milwaukee's in an interesting spot tonight because they play Minnesota. They're a 3.5-point favorite. Then they go and play Oklahoma City tomorrow night, and the Thunder's really gotten this thing figured out here of late. The big three's starting to share the basketball a little bit more. Things are looking a lot better for them. So what about a situation like that with Milwaukee? How would you incorporate that differently?
Oh man, Milwaukee is so tough to figure out, not because of the kind of the construction of the roster, but the coaching is not rational. Jason Kidd is not making rational decisions and rational adjustments, in my opinion. He's blown in the wind, and he's a Hall of Fame player, fantastic. He is not, in my opinion, a particularly good coach, and so you kind of have to, if you're backing the Bucks, especially as a favorite against a team that's as talented as the Minnesota Timberwolves, you kind of have to get lucky that he's made the right adjustments or he's got the right game plan drawn up for a given game. And there's you can't understate how good Giannis is. He's, in my opinion, in 2018 this season, he's a top 3 player in the league with maybe he's clearly a top 5. I like him in the top 3 with LeBron and Durant. And I think you can look at, does he have a favorable matchup against this particular defense where if this is a close game in the fourth quarter, he's going to be able to get his shot off. He's going to be able to score points. He's going to be able to dictate the pace and the style of play. And if you can make a case that he can against a team like Minnesota where, Cat's not playing particularly good defense and, there are potentially some decent matchups here for Giannis. I think it's not out of it. It makes sense at least to look for Milwaukee in a spot like this. Now, knowing that Milwaukee is going to Oklahoma City tomorrow and that they're going to have another tough game, I don't love the matchup as much for Giannis, especially because between Paul George and Steven Adams, I think you're going to be able to do enough to disrupt Giannis late in the game, and I'll probably be looking for Oklahoma City tomorrow. And I would say Milwaukee probably. I don't know. Looking ahead to the game against Oklahoma City is probably like, man, we've been struggling. We beat the Cavs, whoop-de-doo, but then we lost to the Bulls. Like, we need to get a win here. We're hovering around 500. This game here is against Minnesota. I would have circled if I was the Bucks players, and I think we see their best effort tonight against Minnesota, and then maybe they pull back a little bit against Oklahoma City.
Well, good to get you on Bang the Book Radio here. And like I said to our listeners, make sure you follow him on Twitter @whale_capper. You do a great podcast of your own, and you're always open to banter with people on Twitter and very approachable in terms of your strategies. So thank you so much for joining us, man. Really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll get a chance to talk to you again soon.
Hey, absolutely. It was so great having, thank you for having me on, and I wish you and your listeners a happy new year.